Chapter 8 Lady of the North. Sometimes Artorius had strange dreams. Often Myrddin could explain their meaning, but most were forgotten prior to the druid's visits. One particular dream had recurred on numerous occasions, though Artorius had thought it too insignificant to mention. It always ended with a bear and a wild boar meeting in a forest. In the northernmost extreme of Prydain, a youth of 18 looked across the sea. The wild boar, recently tattooed onto her shoulder, still hurt, but she had grown into a tough warrior. Dunstane watched as the leather-bound boats gathered in the harbour. This time, she would be expected to join them when they left. Strangely for a Pict, she didn't much like boats. Her seasickness was a constant source of amusement to her friends. She must have inherited it from her Romano-Prydain mother, they would joke. The raiders were gathering on the request of her half-brother, Drest. They usually raided with the Germani, but this raid was to be an entirely Picty affair. The warriors made their way from the open boats to the shelter of the king's hall, giving their names on arrival by listing their ancestral male line, but last names of the lists were always the same: Talrog, son of Garnet, son of Verdek. Dunstane had thought many times that if all the people claiming descent from Verdek were really members of her family, then her forebear must have spent his whole life bedding women. The warmth and hospitality of the hall had been enhanced for the group. Slaves poured out mead and made sure that plates were not free of meat for long. Should a warrior require satisfaction of a different kind, then the slaves were expected to accommodate that too. By examining the tartans on loose tunics and trousers, Dunstane could tell that some of these people had travelled many miles. Oaths were taken and gifts were given before the venture was sacrificed. A slave was placed screaming into a half-dug grave head first. Then the hole was quickly filled with soil until only his legs were visible, moving erratically. It amazed Dunstane how long it took for the movement to stop. A shaman druid threw some chicken entrails into the air, and on landing he examined them closely, announcing that the gods had accepted the sacrifice and good fortune was assured. The next morning came with heads sore from mead, and slaves very happy that the warriors would soon be on their way. Provisions were packed under the seats on boats that gave little comfort from the elements or movement of the sea. Dunstane reluctantly boarded one of the lead vessels. The boat hugged the coast at first, and as expected the seasickness started. Most of the Picty rowed, but Dunstane spent long periods of time hanging over the edge of the boat. It was well into the second day before the sickness subsided. Lucky, too, because they were heading out to sea. The people of the southern Prydain had posted lookouts near the Great Wall, so these needed to be avoided. In fact, they had been at sea for 5 days before they set a course for the coast of southern Prydain. They didn't want to go too far south. Parties of Picty traders had already scouted the land. King Coel could still amass forces, but they knew it would take time for him to react. They were gambling on being long gone before the old Duke of the South and his men were able to muster. Reaching the coast by night, they tracked their progress along the flat, cliffless shoreline. The secret to night raids was to make as much noise and confusion as possible. People running around in a panic cannot mount an effective defence. The Picty were masters of the art. The village fell easily, offering little fight and little gain. As slaves, the people may have been worth something, but would take up too much space. Better to kill them and move on. The slave trade was better suited to the Germani with their large ships. Near to the village, a Romano-Prydain villa offered some resistance and even cost a few Picty lives. However, its treasure was disappointing until Drest removed the hood of a captive. The face beneath was an alabaster white, with elegant features framed by jet-black hair. A pull at the robe revealed the terrified young woman to have a shapely figure. Drest decided that this was a dish not to be rushed, but to be appreciated at leisure. The Picty had become aware of the Romano-Prydain habit of burying treasure, An old Prydain man bore an impressive amount of pain before breaking and giving the location of a hoard. The raid turned out to be far more lucrative than Drest had first expected. Safely at sea, Drest took his prize in full view of the men as they shouted encouragement. Dunstane wondered if this had been how her father had taken her mother some 20 years earlier. With the spoils safely loaded on a boat, including the Romano-Prydain woman, Isolde, Drest decided to continue the raids while sending his cargo back home in the care of his sister. Drest's instruction to the men was clear. The woman was his, not to be touched. Dunstane was glad to be heading north, and to an early end to the shifting footholds of the boat, though the men provided dull company and the woman just huddled in the stern of the craft refusing to eat. Dunstane concluded that the woman may be Drest's, but there wouldn't be much of her left by the time they reached their stronghold in the north. Dunstane's attempts to show off her limited grasp of Celtic tongue were fruitless. Inquiring about the cross the woman wore about her neck and noting that her mother had one like it only brought the response of, "Well, I expect you would take that from me soon as well." Dunstane thought it best just to leave her alone. She would get used to the situation sooner or later. She would have to. The Pict consoled herself with the fact that even though the companionship was poor, the seasickness seemed to be cured, or at least reduced to a manageable level. In hindsight, her optimism proved to be premature. The waves grew to a height where sometimes the coast could be seen, and then a second later it was gone. They were north of the Great Wall, and the biting cold of the wind made them fully aware of that fact. The sleet reduced their visibility until it became difficult to distinguish between cloud and sea, while the boat pitched and turned alarmingly. Dunstane couldn't remember if she'd heard the thud, an impact that seemed to stop the boat halfway up a wave, or the terrible noise of the rock ripping into the side of the boat. Swept from the vessel, Dunstane was immersed in the breathtaking cold of the North Sea. It had been chance that she had removed her chainmail and replaced it with furs. She seemed to be more susceptible to the cold than her male companions, and this, in effect, helped save her life. Isolde was near but barely floating, and did not appear to be putting much effort into doing so either. The boat had disappeared quickly. Dunstane thought she had caught sight of some of her shipmates, but a wave rose and they were lost, becoming distant specks obscured by the next wave. Dunstane grabbed Isolde and held her close. The cold made even thought difficult. What was she to do? They had strayed too close to the shore, but an unusual, unforgiving sea cast the pair unceremoniously onto a remote beach. Dunstane pulled Isolde from the water's edge. Tired as she was, she knew the cold had become their deadliest foe. First shelter, and then warmth were the Pict's priorities. Luckily, a small cave they found in the cliff face held enough dry driftwood to start a fire. The flints Dunstane kept in the pouch, attached to her belt, were difficult to handle with her cold, shaking hands. She almost cried, but not quite, before her long efforts finally saw the fire take hold. After removing her sodden clothes, she turned her attention to Isolde. Removing her garment revealed a body that was worthy of her beautiful face. Dunstane had never seen such perfection. Her eyes moved from her exquisite curves to well-formed legs, and then Isolde's eyes opened and bore into the Pict's soul. Holding Isolde close by the fire, feeling the warmth return to their bodies, Dunstane wasn't sure if she was trembling with cold or intense emotion. There they lay in an embrace that led to sleep. The morning brought a calm sea. It was difficult to imagine it was part of the same angry ocean that had roared the previous night. The fire had been built well and still gave off warmth. Their clothes were almost dry, and the furs, though damp, could still protect them from the elements. Scavenging along the shore, Dunstane found enough sea lettuce and shellfish to give them an unappetizing but needed breakfast, a breakfast that Isolde declined. Dunstane knew that they were many days' walk from her home, and so needed to trade the few coins in her pouch quickly. Isolde obeyed the instructions to walk, and they left the beach. The coins brought more than Dunstane had imagined. From a croft with the sign of a fish on its door, she negotiated for provisions. A long knife, cord, and even old but functional footwear. Dunstane decided they should head for the forest and find shelter for the night. From the arc of the sun she could work out which way was north, and that would be the direction they would travel. The shelter was basic, but the fire was warm, though perhaps it needed a little more wood. Dunstane left Isolde, her concentration focused on finding fuel. Turning back, Dunstane saw the fire reflected in the blade of the knife. Charging forward, Dunstane grabbed Isolde's wrist and forced her to release the knife, but wasn't able to stop the blade cutting into Isolde's arm in the struggle. Another blade length across, and there would have been nothing that the Pictie could have done. Dunstane shouted at her companion, and, looking into her eyes that held the sadness of the world, she just wanted to hug her, hold her so tightly that she would become part of her. "I am not going to him. I prefer to die, and I will." Isolde spoke in a hesitant but resolute voice. It had been the most she had said to Dunstane. Dunstane stroked Isolde's face, then made a statement that surprised Isolde and herself. "You don't have to." Dunstane dressed the wound with moss and then applied a bandage as the cold night air hung heavier over the wood. They removed their damp clothes under the comfort of fur, and the two were close again. Dunstane's heartbeat quickened. Then she felt Isolde tighten her grip around her waist, and tears came to the Pictie warrior's eyes. This was the warmth she had sought all her life, without knowing it. Both in tears they lay in the wood, comforted by each other's company. The next morning the couple travelled south towards the wall, then east towards the mountains, a place the Pictie seldom travelled to. Dunstane's cord gave them a diet of rabbit, a diet that at last Isolde indulged in. That night the two women were close again. Dunstane hesitantly took Isolde's hand. Their faces were inches apart. Isolde wanted to say something, but couldn't speak. Their lips met, and Isolde's mouth opened in acceptance. The brief kiss was soon followed by a longer, more passionate encore. Hands moved to areas of Dunstane that no man had found. Her back arched with pleasure as her satisfaction grew. The night ended with Isolde sleeping close to Dunstane, her head upon her saviour's chest. An isolated valley a few miles from a small northern Prydain Keltie settlement provided a sanctuary for Dunstane and Isolde. They refurbished an old crofter's hut. Dunstane hunted and sold furs, and enough vegetation grew around the hut or could be collected from the forest to keep the couple fed. They shared some of the Keltie ceremonies, and Dunstane became known to all as the Pictish man. She didn't mind. If it helped the people make sense of her, then that was that. Isolde was a keen Christian, and Dunstane was to learn much about Christ, whether she liked it or not. One morning Dunstane received a message. It was from her brother. It seemed Drest's contact spread further from northern Pictland than Dunstane realized, and he had received news of her. Tears filled her eyes upon reading the letter's contents. As she read, she remembered the strong young man who had taught her how to fight and who had fought with his friends on her behalf. As a girl, it had seemed that he knew everything, was stronger and faster than anyone, but best of all, he was her brother, and on her side, whatever she faced. Dunstane choked back her emotions. He didn't care about her betrayal or what the other Pictie thought. They could think what they wanted. If they voiced their opinion of him as a fool or of her as an unnatural whore, then he would kill them. They would soon learn to hold their tongues, he was sure of that. Drest gave her the news that he had fathered a son, and his child needed to be taught bow skills by the best, by Dunstane. She let the tears flow freely. She thought of her friends. She thought of feasting under the northern lights, but most of all she thought of her warm, safe home of her childhood. "We are going to Pictland," Dunstane announced to Isolde, with tears turning her eyes into mirrors. In those mirrors, Isolde saw herself, a young girl missing the place where she had grown up, a place she had loved and been loved. Isolde hugged Dunstane. "I am sorry I came between you and your people, but to go back is madness." Isolde felt her lover's pain as surely as the breath she felt on her neck. Dunstane hugged Isolde even more tightly. No, no, it's all right. Drest isn't angry. It will be fine. I don't trust him. He took me. I didn't want that, Isolde cried out. I cannot undo what has been done. Please forgive him. You talk a lot about forgiveness. Dunstane looked into Isolde's eyes. We will drink the most beautiful mead and see the sky light with all the most wonderful colours you can imagine. Isolde saw the love Dunstane had for her people, the pain she felt to be parted from them. How could a true lover cause the person most important to them in the world such pain? She would try to forgive Drest for the sake of her own soul, and for Dunstane. It was less than a week before Dunstane and Isolde approached the northern stronghold of Drest. Dominated by 2 huge stone towers and a great hall, the fort looked out of place, almost alien in the wilderness in which it had been built. Isolde's nervousness grew as she moved closer to the cold granite walls. Let's go back. This is just silly. Isolde's eyes pleaded with Dunstane. Dunstane's face beamed with a smile. No, it will be fine. You will see. The gates opened and Drest himself came out to greet them, accompanied by 8 men. He sped towards his sister. Dunstane was just as eager to greet her brother and urged her horse forward. She approached his horse and noted the tears welling in his eyes and the emotion contorting his face. Her eyes watered as she moved towards him. His punch met her open-armed welcome with a thud. She fell from her horse and lay stunned on the ground. The kick Drest put into her side helped snap her from her shock. "You bitch!" Drest screamed, spittle projecting from his mouth. The next punch he delivered knocked her unconscious. The intensity of the midday light and the banging in Dunstane's head accompanied her awaking from a less than pleasant experience. Drest greeted his sister. "You humiliate me, and then run off." He was shaking, barely controlling his emotions. "It is time for your whore to have a man." Drest pointed to Isolde, who was kneeling at his feet, her gaze focused intensely on the floor. "In fact, a few men." Dunstane tried to talk, but was brutally gagged before her words could be fully formed. Drest took Isolde first, taking his anger out on her body. Dunstane screamed and strained against the ropes that held her in place. Isolde tried not to show how much pain she was in. 4 of Drest's men then took turns with Isolde. Her pain subsided into numbness of body and soul. When they were finished, Drest's guards held Dunstane's head to ensure that she faced her lover. The knife did its work quickly, cutting Isolde's throat and penetrating Dunstane's heart. "You broke my heart. Now I have broken yours. Leave this place and never ever return. Next time we meet I will kill you." Drest's temper had cooled somewhat, but his eyes were still intense. Dunstane was taken from the fort, and after another beating, she was left on the road. It took 2 months for her to physically recover, and another 2 months until she was back to full strength. In fact, her strength was greater than before, reinforced by a steely determination and hatred. Dunstane returned to her brother's fort and entered Pictish legend. The tale of the North tell of a wild woman who entered the king's stronghold unseen. Her progress through the building could be followed, signposted by the dead guards. The next morning, the king's head was found on the table of his hall. Only one thing was left for Dunstane to do in Pictland. She retrieved her lover's ashes. At least her Picti kin showed reverence for the dead, far more respect than they had shown for Isolde while she had been alive. The wild woman disappeared. A price was placed upon her head, but few were keen to take up the challenge.